The truck had no business making the drive. A 1998 Chevrolet with 327,000 miles on an engine that knocked when it idled, and a transmission that thought about second gear for a full 3 seconds before committing. The bench seat had a permanent sag on the driver's side from a man who had sat in it almost every day for 26 years. The AM radio pulled in 2 stations clearly and 4 more as ghosts. There was no air conditioning. The windows worked if you asked them nicely, and even then the passenger side had a habit of stopping 3 inches short of closed, letting in a thin whistle of highway air that had become so familiar, Earl Maddox no longer heard it. He drove at 400 miles anyway. From a 2-bedroom house outside Lawton, Oklahoma, down through the red dirt flats and the cattle country, and the small towns that existed mostly as speed limit changes on a highway that did not care about them, to a precision rifle expo on a sprawling piece of ranch land south of Fort Worth, Texas. He drove with both hands on the wheel the way they taught him when he was 17, back when driver's education was still something the county offered, and the instructor was a Korean War veteran named Mr. Pollard, who believed that a man who could not keep 2 hands on the wheel had no business operating a vehicle, and probably no business doing much of anything else either. Earl had kept both hands on the wheel for 62 years since, and he was not going to stop now because the highway was straight and empty, and the only other vehicles were long-haul trucks, whose drivers were probably not using their hands for the wheel at all. He stopped once for gas at a Conoco station outside Gainesville, where the pumps were the old kind that clicked slowly and the price per gallon was displayed on a sign that someone had to change by hand with a pole and a set of plastic numbers. He stopped once for the restroom at a rest area where the concrete was cracked and the vending machines were dark, and a historical marker told him something about the Butterfield Overland Mail route that he read entirely because Earl Maddox was a man who read things that were put in front of him even when they did not matter, because you never knew when something would matter, and the habit of paying attention had saved his life more than once. He did not stop for food because he had packed 2 ham sandwiches in wax paper and a thermos of black coffee, and the sandwiches were made the way Maggie used to make them, with yellow mustard and a single leaf of iceberg lettuce, because that was the way she had made them for 47 years, and Earl saw no reason to change the recipe just because the woman who invented it was no longer alive to eat one with him. Maggie had been gone 3 years. 3 years, 2 months, and 14 days, if you counted the way Earl counted, which was every morning when he woke up and reached across the bed to the side that was still made, because he only slept on his side and the other side stayed flat and cool and empty, the way a place stays when the person who filled it is never coming back. Cancer had taken her the way it takes the ones who refuse to make a fuss about it. Quietly over months, with a dignity that made the doctors uncomfortable because they were used to patients who fought and raged and demanded answers, and Maggie had done none of those things. She had listened to the diagnosis with her hands folded in her lap and asked 2 questions. The first was how long. The second was whether the garden would survive the winter if she mulched it heavy in October. The doctor had not known what to say to the second question. Earl had. He told her he would mulch it himself, and he would water it, and he would keep it alive. And he had every Tuesday and Friday, even the flowers he could not name, even the ones that bloomed in colors he privately thought were too bright for a yard, because she had asked him to, and Earl Maddox was a man who kept his promises long past the point where anyone was checking. The house was quiet without her, not empty because it was still full of her things, her books on the shelf by the window, her reading glasses on the kitchen counter where she always left them, her coat on the hook by the back door, the one with the torn pocket she kept meaning to mend. Earl had not moved any of it. He was not sentimental about it, or at least he did not think he was. He simply saw no reason to disturb things that were where they belonged. The glasses were on the counter because that was where Maggie put them. Moving them would be a statement, and Earl Maddox did not make statements. He had spent the better part of his adult life specifically avoiding them. On the passenger seat beside the thermos sat a photograph. It was old enough that the color had gone to amber at the edges, and the surface had the slightly sticky feel of a print that had been handled too many times by hands that were not always clean. It was the kind of photograph that predated digital by decades, taken with a camera that used film and required you to wait for the pictures to come back from the drugstore in a paper envelope. And when they came back, you looked at them once and put them in a drawer, or you looked at them every day for the rest of your life. This photograph was the second kind. Two young men in utilities standing in front of a sandbag position with a valley falling away behind them into haze and green, and the kind of distance that swallows sound. One held a rifle across his chest, an M40, the woodstock dark with oil and use, and he was not smiling. He was looking at the camera with the flat, unreadable expression of a man who had already seen enough to know that photographs lie, that the moment they capture is never the moment that mattered, and that the real things, the things that stay with you, never hold still long enough to be framed. The other one held binoculars and was grinning. Not smiling, grinning with the full-faced, reckless joy of a 19-year-old who did not yet know what the world costs, who still believed that youth and quickness and the particular invincibility of being 19 were permanent conditions rather than loans that the universe would call in without warning and without mercy. He was lean and sunburned, and his teeth were white against the tan of his face, and his eyes were squinted against the light, and he looked like every 19-year-old who has ever stood in a place where he should not have been and found something in it to grin about anyway. The boy with the grin was named Jimmy Pruitt. Corporal James Pruitt, if you read it the way the Marine Corps wrote it, which was on a wall in Washington, and on a headstone in a cemetery in Tulsa, and on a certificate in a frame, in a house that belonged to a woman who had outlived her son by decades and had never once forgiven the world for the order in which things had happened. Jimmy had been Earl's spotter. 9 months they had worked together, which in the peculiar mathematics of that kind of work was longer than most marriages and more intimate than any of them, because a shooter and a spotter share a language that has no words, a trust that has no contract, and a dependency that is absolute. The shooter pulls the trigger, but the spotter calls the wind, reads the range, does the math, and if the math is wrong, the shooter misses. And if the shooter misses in the kind of place where Earl and Jimmy worked, the miss is not a miss. It is a death. Someone else's or your own, and the difference between the two is a 19-year-old with binoculars and a grin who can calculate windage in his head faster than a computer and who never, not once in 9 months, gave Earl a bad number. Jimmy had been killed on the last day of their last operation in a valley that Earl did not name, not even to himself, not even in the privacy of his own thoughts. He referred to it, when he referred to it at all, as that valley, the way a man refers to a wound he has stopped examining but has never stopped feeling. A round had come in from a position they had not seen, and it had taken Jimmy in the throat, and Earl had watched the grin go out of the world in the time it takes to blink, and the world had never fully relit since. He had carried Jimmy off that hill, not because it was required, not because anyone had ordered it, not because there was any tactical reason to risk his own life, dragging a dead man through fire to a landing zone that might or might not still be there when he arrived. He did it because Jimmy was his spotter, and you do not leave your spotter on a hill. You do not leave him for the detail to collect, to be put in a bag by men who did not know him, who did not know that he was afraid of spiders, and could do long division in his head, and had a younger sister who sent him cookies that were always crushed by the time they arrived, but that he ate anyway every crumb because she had made them. You carry him yourself. You carry him because the last thing you can do for someone you were not able to save is to make sure he does not leave that place alone. Earl had driven straight from the base to the funeral in Oklahoma. He had not slept. He had not changed. He had shown up at the church in utilities that still had mud on them, and had stood at the back and had said nothing to anyone, and had left before the reception because he could not stand the casseroles and the flowers and the well-meaning faces of people who wanted to tell him that Jimmy was in a better place, because Earl knew exactly what place Jimmy was in, and it was a box in the ground, and there was nothing better about it. He had not gone back. He had not called. He had not written. He had disappeared into the vast interior of the country the way certain men do when the thing they have survived is too large to carry, in a place where people might see it. He had come home to Oklahoma, married Maggie, taken a job at a hardware store that became a career, at a hardware store that became a retirement from a hardware store, and he had lived a life so quiet and so deliberate in its smallness that the man who had once done the things Earl Maddox had done became for all practical purposes invisible. That was the word, invisible. Earl had made himself invisible not through effort, but through the simple practice of never drawing attention, never raising his voice, never standing where the light could find him. He was the man who sat at the end of the counter at the diner and read the paper and drank his coffee and left exact change and a $2 tip and never once told the waitress that the reason his hands shook a little in the morning had nothing to do with the coffee and everything to do with a hill and a bow and a sound he could still hear when the wind was right. And now he was driving 400 miles to shoot at a steel plate. The idea had come to him 3 weeks earlier in a barber shop in Lawton, sitting in the chair while a man named Curtis cut his hair the way Curtis had been cutting it for 15 years short, on the sides a little longer on top, nothing fancy. There was a magazine on the counter, one of those glossy shooting publications that Earl never bought, but occasionally thumbed through when they appeared in waiting rooms and barber shops and the break room at the VFW. And this one had a piece about a precision rifle expo in Texas, and the centerpiece of the expo was a challenge. $25,000 in cash to anyone who could ring a 10-inch swinging plate at 800 yards with open sights and no bipod and one cold shot. Earl had read the article twice. He had looked at the photograph of the plate on its chain, the small steel disc turning slow against the Texas sky, and something had moved in him that had not moved in a very long time. Not excitement, not ambition, not the competitive urge that drives younger men to prove themselves against each other and against the limits of their equipment. What moved in him was older than that and quieter, and it had to do with a 19-year-old who had loved math and who would have read that article and done the calculations in his head, the windage and the elevation and the lead on a moving target, and would have looked up from the magazine with that grin and said, "Earl, we could make that shot in our sleep." We. Always we, because it had never been Earl alone. It had always been the two of them, the shooter and the spotter, the rifle, and the math, and the shot was only as good as the number that preceded it, and the number was Jimmy's. Earl had put the magazine down on the counter and looked at himself in the barber's mirror, an old man with white hair and a face that had more lines in it than a topographic map, and eyes that still worked well enough to read the date on a dime at arm's length. But that would not, he knew, work well enough for very much longer. Time was taking things from him the way time takes things from everyone slowly, and then all at once, and there was a finite number of mornings left in which he would be able to see a front sight post clearly enough to put it on a target and trust what he saw. He had decided in the barber's chair, while Curtis was trimming around his left ear, that he was going to make the drive. He had not told anyone because there was no one to tell. Maggie was gone. He had no children. His neighbors knew him as the quiet man who watered his garden and waved from the driveway and kept his yard mowed and his house painted and his truck running through what appeared to be sheer stubbornness and an unwillingness to let anything in his care deteriorate. Not because he needed a truck that ran, but because maintenance was a form of respect, and Earl respected the things he had been given, even when the things were old and tired and held together by habit more than engineering. He arrived at the expo grounds in the late afternoon of the second day, but he did not go in. He parked the truck at the far end of the lot where the dirt turned to grass and the grass turned to fence line, and he sat with the engine off and the windows down and listened to the distant crack of rifle fire rolling across the flat land. The sound came in bursts, irregular, a conversation between men and steel that Earl could read the way some men read music. He could hear the caliber in the pitch, the distance in the delay, the competence of the shooter in the rhythm of the string. A fast string was a nervous shooter rushing his shots. A slow string was a careful one, building his position between rounds. A single shot followed by a long silence was a man thinking, or a man packing up, or a man staring down range at a miss that had cost him something. He drove to a gas station motel 3 miles down the highway. It was the kind of motel that existed because highways existed, a low building with a gravel lot and a sign that was missing 2 letters and a front desk, staffed by a woman who did not look up from her phone when he came in. He paid $47 cash for a room that smelled like industrial soap and old carpet and had a bedspread that he pulled back and folded at the foot of the bed because Maggie had always said that motel bedspreads were the filthiest things in civilization and you should never let them touch your skin. And even 3 years after her death, Earl could hear her say it in the exact tone she used for things that were non-negotiable. He set the alarm for 5. He always set it for 5, even when there was no reason. Some habits have nothing to do with need and everything to do with the shape a man has worn into his own life over decades of repetition. 5 o'clock was when Earl Maddox woke up, and 5 o'clock was when the world began, and the hours before 5 belonged to the dark and to the things that lived in it, and Earl had learned a long time ago that it was better to be awake and moving when those things came than to be lying still and waiting for them to find him. He slept poorly. He always slept poorly in beds that were not his own, which was ironic for a man who had once slept on the ground for months at a time without complaint. But the ground had been familiar in its discomfort, predictable, and this mattress was soft in the wrong places, and the pillow was too thick, and the air conditioner made a rattling sound that kept pulling him back from the edge of sleep the way a hand pulls a drowning man from the water. Except in this case, the drowning was preferable. He was up at 4:53, 7 minutes before the alarm, the way he always was. He shaved in the motel bathroom with a safety razor that had belonged to his father. He dressed in the same clothes he had driven in because he had not brought others. He ate the first ham sandwich standing at the window looking out at the parking lot where his truck sat alone under a light that buzzed and attracted moths. On the third morning, he was through the expo gate by 7. The grounds in early light had the feeling of a small city waking up. The white vendor tents ran in rows like a military encampment, their sides snapping in the morning wind. Banners for optics companies and barrel makers and ammunition brands hung from every pole, bright and clean, and designed by people who understood the specific visual language of men who spent money on precision. Logos with eagles and crosshairs and the muted earth tones of tactical culture, everything radiating competence and expense. The smell was gun oil and cut grass and fairground coffee, the coffee coming from a trailer near the entrance where a man in a baseball cap was dispensing it from a machine that held 3 gallons and cost $2 a cup, and the coffee was terrible, the flat, burnt, over-extracted coffee of events and gas stations and waiting rooms. But Earl bought a cup and drank it because coffee was coffee, and the point of it was the warmth in your hands and the ritual of holding something while you watch things. And there was a great deal to watch. The expo was a showcase for the modern precision rifle world, and the modern precision rifle world was a thing that would have been unrecognizable to the man Earl Maddox had been in 1969. The rifles on display were not rifles in any sense that Earl's generation would have understood. They were systems platforms, integrated packages of carbon fiber and titanium and computer machine steel that cost as much as a car and came with software. Shooters carried tablets. They had weather stations on tripods. They had rangefinders that bounced laser light off targets and returned the distance to the tenth of a yard. They had ballistic calculators that took the distance and the wind speed and the temperature and the humidity and the elevation and the barometric pressure and the Coriolis effect of the Earth's rotation and produced a firing solution that told the shooter exactly where to hold, exactly how many clicks to dial, exactly when to break the trigger. Earl watched all of it with the same expression he wore when he watched the Weather Channel, a mild detached interest that concealed a much deeper assessment. He understood what these men were doing. He understood the technology. He was not a Luddite. He knew that a ballistic calculator could produce a more precise firing solution than a man's head, in the same way that a calculator could produce a more precise answer to a math problem than a pencil and paper. But he also knew something that the calculators did not know, and could not know, which was what the wind was doing between the muzzle and the target, in the places where no meter stood, and what the air was doing in the columns and layers above the ground where no sensor reached, and how the terrain shaped the flow of the atmosphere in ways that changed from minute to minute and could not be modeled and could not be predicted and could only be seen by a man who had learned to look. And in the center of all of it, on a raised platform visible from every angle, sat a locked plexiglass case with $25,000 in cash arranged in neat banded stacks where the sun could find them. The bills were hundreds clean and new, and they sat in the case like an altar offering, untouched and untouchable, and around them, the expo hummed and buzzed, and the vendors sold their wares, and the shooters talked about their loads and their rifles and their data, and the money just sat there, patient and indifferent, waiting. The real attraction hung 800 yards away at the far end of a mowed field. A 10-inch steel plate on a chain suspended from a crossarm connected to a small electric motor, and a cam that gave it a slow, hypnotic sway. Left pause, right pause. A lazy pendulum, rhythmic but not metronomic, because the cam introduced a slight variation in the timing that made the swing unpredictable enough that you could not simply count and fire. You had to watch. You had to learn the rhythm. You had to feel it. The rules were printed on a board the size of a door mounted on posts beside the firing point. They were short and brutal. Open sights only, no scope, no magnification of any kind, no bipod, no rest, no bag, no mechanical support of any kind. One cold shot per attempt, one cartridge, one opportunity, no sighting rounds, no fouling shots, no second chances. The plate must be in motion at the time of the shot. Ammunition provided by the Expo. 7.62 NATO 168 grain match. Earl read the rules twice. He read them the way he read everything slowly, completely, making sure he understood not just what they said, but what they meant, because rules and meanings are not always the same thing, and a man who assumes they are will eventually find himself on the wrong side of both. 143 competitors had signed the sheet over 2 days. 143 had walked back from that firing line with their jaws set and their ears red, and the particular tightness in their shoulders that comes from public failure at a thing you believed you could do. Some of them had come close. A few had come very close, close enough that the sound of the bullet passing the plate could be heard by the spotters in the observation tent. A thin whisper of displaced air that was almost but not quite the sound of steel being struck. But almost is a very large word at 800 yards, and the plate had swung through every attempt untouched, and the money sat in its case, and the crowd grew thicker each day because people are drawn to impossible things, the way moths are drawn to light. Not because they expect to see success, but because they want to be present when the impossible is finally attempted by the person who does not know it is impossible. Earl stood at the back of that crowd most of the morning. He found a spot between a tent selling custom reloading dies and a tent selling shooting glasses, and he stood there with his cup of bad coffee and watched. Nobody noticed him. He wore a faded ball cap with no logo, the kind you get for free at a farm supply store, and wear until the brim goes soft and the adjustable strap in the back loses its last notch of tightness. His windbreaker was 2 sizes too big because he had lost weight in the years since Maggie died. The slow, unintentional weight loss of a man who eats because the clock says it is time to eat, rather than because his body asks for it, and he had not seen the point in buying new clothes because the old ones still covered him, and vanity was a luxury he had never been able to afford, even when he was young enough to spend it. His boots were older than some of the shooters on the line. They were plain brown leather resoled twice with laces that had been replaced so many times the eyelets were worn to ovals. His hands, when they were not holding the coffee cup, had a faint tremor, the kind that comes not from disease but from age, and from the particular exhaustion of having carried heavy things for a very long time. Some men's hands shake because they are nervous. Some men's hands shake because they are old. And some men's hands shake because the weight of what they have held is still in them long after the thing itself has been set down. He watched the young guns come up one at a time. He watched them approach the firing line with the confident stride of men who had prepared for this, who had practiced, who had data and dope and equipment and experience, and the unshakable belief that preparation was the same as readiness. Custom actions on chassis stocks that looked like they had been designed by aerospace engineers, all sharp angles and adjustment knobs, and accessory rails rifles that weighed 12 pounds and cost $15,000 and could in theory put every round through the same hole at 1,000 yards. Except they could not put a round through a 10-inch plate at 800. Not today. Not with open sights, not with the plate swinging and the wind pushing and the sun in their eyes, and 100 people watching and $25,000 riding on a single press of the trigger. Earl watched them build their positions. He watched them settle behind their rifles. He watched them acquire the plate through their iron sights and hold on it and track it through its swing and break the trigger at the point where they believed the bullet and the plate would meet. And he watched the plate swing through the bullet's path an instant before or an instant after the round arrived, and he watched the steel stay silent, and he heard the flat crack of the bullet impacting the dirt berm behind the target, a muted, disappointing sound that was the acoustical equivalent of failure. And he watched the shooters curse softly into their sleeves and clear their rifles and stand up and walk back from the line with the specific dignity of men who had just been humbled by 10 inches of AR-500 on a chain. He was not smug about it. There was nothing in his face you could call superiority or satisfaction or the quiet pleasure of a man who knows something that the men in front of him do not. He just watched the way a man watches weather he has seen before with a calm, informed patience that comes from having stood in enough storms to know that they all follow patterns and the patterns are readable if you know what to look for. He understood what they were doing wrong, all of them, every single one. They were reading their instruments instead of reading the field. They had wind meters mounted on tripods beside their positions, kestrel weather stations that measured wind speed and direction and temperature and humidity and barometric pressure and gave them a number, and they were using that number to calculate their wind hold, and the number was wrong. Not wrong in the sense that the instrument was inaccurate. The instrument was extremely accurate, but it was accurate at the firing point, and the bullet did not stay at the firing point. The bullet traveled 800 yards through air that was not the same at every point along its path, air that swirled and shifted and gusted and paused and behaved differently at the creek bottom than it did at the midfield, and differently at the midfield than it did at the target, and the kestrel could not tell them any of that because the kestrel was here and the bullet was going there, and the space between here and there was the problem. And no instrument on Earth could solve it from one end. The grass could. There was a strip of taller growth the mowers had missed along a creek bottom that cut across the field about 400 yards out. The seed heads on that grass were moving, and the way they moved told a story that no meter could tell. The story of how the wind behaved between the ground and the bullet's path, where it gusted, and where it paused, where it accelerated around the contour of the terrain, and where it stalled in the lee of the creek bank, where it ran clean and straight, and where it tumbled and swirled. The grass told all of it, every nuance, every variation, in a language that was continuous, in real time, and three-dimensional, and not one man on that firing line was reading it. Earl watched that grass for 2 hours. He stood at the back of the crowd with his terrible coffee, and he watched the seed heads lean and stand and lean again, and he timed the pulses, and he counted the interval between the gusts, and he watched the way the wind walked across the field in waves visible. Waves the same way wind walks across water, and he built a picture of the air between the firing line and the plate that was as detailed and accurate as anything a supercomputer could have modeled, and more useful because it was happening now in real time, and it changed every few minutes, and Earl changed his picture with it. He also watched the heat shimmer over the berm at the back of the range, the mirage, the rippling distortion that heat rising from the ground creates in the air above it. The mirage moved. It boiled to the left, or it boiled to the right, or it rose straight up, and the direction it boiled told you the direction of the wind at the target, and the speed at which it boiled told you the velocity. And if you could read the mirage and the grass at the same time, you could build a model of the wind along the entire bullet path that was accurate enough to put a round on a 10-inch plate at 800 yards. If you knew how, if you had learned, if you had paid the price of the learning in a currency that was not money. Nobody asked him what he was looking at. Nobody asked him anything at all. He was good at that not being seen. He had spent a large and important part of his life being the man nobody noticed, and old habits keep their grip long after the reason for them is gone. The best snipers are not the best shooters. They are the best disappearers. They are the men who can occupy a space without filling it, who can be present without being seen, who can stand in the open and somehow convince the world that the open is empty. Earl had been very good at this for a very long time, and even now at 79, even here at a rifle expo in Texas, the skill held. He was invisible. The crowd moved around him the way water moves around a stone, without noticing the stone, without adjusting for it, because the stone had made itself so much a part of the current that the current had forgotten it was there. Around noon, the crowd thinned for lunch. Shooters drifted toward the food trucks and the beer tents, and the firing line went quiet, and Earl walked down to the observation area and looked through the spotting scope that was mounted on a post for spectators. He put his eye to the lens and found the plate, and he watched it swing, and he studied the chain and the cam and the motor, and he learned the rhythm, the way a musician learns a tempo, not by counting but by feeling, by letting the swing enter his body through his eye, and settle into the part of his brain that understood timing, the part that had once put a bullet into a space that a target was going to occupy a second and a half later, because the bullet and the target were both moving, and the trick was not to hit the target where it was, but to hit the space where it was going to be, and let the universe deliver the two of them to the same place at the same time. He watched the plate for 20 minutes. He learned its swing. He learned its variations. He learned the slight hesitation at the end of each arc where the cam reversed, and he learned the speed of the travel through the center, and he learned the relationship between the wind and the swing. How a gust would push the plate a few degrees off its normal path, and how the chain would absorb the push and return the plate to its rhythm. And he filed all of it in the same place where he kept the wind data in the vast, silent, organized darkness of a memory that had been built for this purpose and had never been emptied. Around 2 in the afternoon, the crowd returned and thickened, and the firing line came back to life, and a young shooter named Tanner Briggs stepped up to the line for his attempt. Tanner Briggs was 31 years old. He was built like a man who spent serious time in a gym and wanted you to know it, with the kind of upper body that required specific shirts and the kind of confidence that required a specific audience. He had a sponsor's logo on his hat and another on his jacket, both from companies that made tactical accessories for men who had never been in a tactical situation but wanted to look like they had. He had a rifle that had been built for him by a company whose name was engraved on the receiver in a font usually reserved for luxury watches, a custom action on a carbon fiber chassis with a titanium bottom metal, and a barrel that had been hand-lapped by a man whose name alone added $1,000 to the price. He had a following online, 80,000 subscribers on his channel, where he posted videos of himself shooting steel at long range with the casual performative confidence of a man who has confused competence with wisdom. He had a podcast where he talked about ballistics and gear and the discipline of the craft, using words like fundamentals and process and send it with the frequency and authority of a man who had learned them from other men's videos rather than from the thing itself. He had opinions about everything in the platform to make sure you heard them, and the opinions were not wrong exactly the way a textbook is not wrong, but they had the specific weightlessness of knowledge that has never been tested by the thing it describes. Tanner Briggs knew a great deal about shooting. He had read every book and watched every video and attended every class. What he did not know, what he could not know, what he had been spared the experience of learning, was what shooting felt like when the target was not steel on a chain, but a thing that moved and breathed and had a name, and when the consequence of missing was not a 0 on a scorecard, but a flag on a mantle. He missed. He missed by a foot, maybe more, and the foot had been the wind, and the wind had been the pulse that moved the grass that Tanner Briggs had not been watching because he had been watching his kestrel. He had done everything right by the book. His position was textbook. His sight picture was textbook. His trigger press was textbook. And the book was wrong because the book was written for the air at the firing point, and the bullet had to fly through 800 yards of air that the book had never read. He came off the line hot, not angry at the plate or the wind or the rules. Angry at himself, which is the most dangerous kind of anger, because it goes looking for someone to land on, and it is not particular about who it finds. Earl chose that moment to walk up to the table. He did not choose it consciously. He had simply watched enough. He had read the field. He had read the plate. He had read the wind and the mirage and the grass. He had built his picture, and the picture was complete. And the part of him that had been waiting quietly at the back of the crowd for 5 hours told the rest of him that it was time, and Earl, who had learned a long time ago to listen to that part, listened. He approached Dana Whitfield, the range officer, a square-shouldered woman in her mid-50s with sun lines deep in her face and the calm, practiced authority of someone who had been running firing lines since before some of these boys could drive. She had short gray hair and steady hands, and the particular posture of a woman who had served the kind of posture that never fully relaxes because the body has been trained to carry itself a certain way, and the training outlasts the uniform by decades. She wore a polo shirt with the Expos logo on the chest and a lanyard around her neck with her credentials, and she carried a clipboard with the sign-up sheet and a stopwatch and a pair of electronic earmuffs pushed up on her forehead like a headband. Earl asked her quietly whether the rules required a competitor to bring his own rifle. Dana looked at him. She looked at the ball cap and the windbreaker and the boots and the hands, and she saw what everyone else saw, which was an old man, and she made the same assumption everyone else made, which was that old men at rifle expos are spectators, not competitors. The way old men at car shows are admirers, not drivers. And the world is full of these assumptions, and most of them are wrong. But nobody checks because checking requires effort and assumptions are free. But Dana Whitfield was better than her assumption. She answered the question directly without condescension, the way a professional answers a professional question, regardless of who is asking it. The rules did not require a competitor to bring his own rifle. The rules required a rifle that met the open sight no bipod standard, and the Expo kept a rack of loaners for people whose airlines had lost their gear, or whose rifles had malfunctioned, or who, for whatever reason, found themselves at the firing point without a weapon. Beat-up trainers mostly, rifles that had been used for demonstration and instruction, and had the ding stocks and worn bluing of tools that had been handled by 1,000 hands and loved by none of them. Earl asked if any of them were an M14 or anything built off one. Dana raised an eyebrow. Not much. Just a degree, the kind of eyebrow raise that a person gives when a question reveals something unexpected about the person asking it. Nobody asked for an M14. Nobody who was serious about long-range precision shooting in the modern era thought about the M14 the way nobody who was serious about racing thought about a 1970 Chevelle. The platform was old. It was heavy. It was semi-automatic in an era of bolt guns. It had a reputation for accuracy that was earned but modest by contemporary standards in its iron sights, while excellent were iron sights, which meant that the shooter was asking his naked eye to do the work that a 12 power scope could do better. But she told him there was one on the rack, an old M1A, the civilian version of the M14 with national match sights, in a walnut stock that had been refinished at least once, and a barrel that was original and showed its age in the slight dullness of the bore when you looked through it from the muzzle end. Nobody had touched it all weekend because nobody who considered himself a real competitor wanted to shoot irons at 800 when they could run glass on the practice range next door. Earl said that one would be fine. He said it the way you would ask for a cup of coffee at a diner where you had been a regular for 30 years. No emphasis, no drama, no awareness that what he was asking for was in any way unusual or insufficient. It was a rifle. It was the right kind of rifle. It was fine. That was when Tanner Briggs decided to make it a show. He had been standing close enough to hear still carrying the heat of his own miss, like a coal in his chest, and the coal needed somewhere to go. And here was something soft and slow-moving he could push against, something that would not push back, something that would absorb the energy of his anger the way a punching bag absorbs a fist without consequence, without cost. He looked Earl up and down, the faded cap, the oversized windbreaker, the boots with their replaced laces and worn eyelets, the tremor in the hands, the age in the face, all of it adding up in Tanner Briggs's rapid and confident arithmetic to a man who did not belong here, who was out of his depth, who was about to embarrass himself in front of 100 people, and who would probably appreciate being told so because being told would save him the trouble of discovering it for himself. He said it loud enough for the entire firing line to hear. "Pops, this isn't bingo night at the VFW. That plate is at 800 yards in its swings. Guys with $30,000 rigs have been missing it for 2 days." A few people laughed. Not many, but enough. The kind of laugh that happens when a crowd is given permission to find something funny by the loudest voice in the room. The kind of laugh that does not survive examination, but does not need to, because it serves its purpose in the moment, which is to draw a line between us and them, between the people who belong and the person who does not. Tanner added something about hip replacements and something about early bird specials and something about the senior discount at Denny's that got a slightly bigger laugh from his sponsor's tent, where two young men in matching hats were watching their investment perform the way an investment is supposed to perform, which is loudly and in public. Earl did not answer. He did not look at Tanner Briggs. He did not acknowledge that words had been spoken, or that laughter had occurred, or that he was the subject of either. He simply picked up the M1A from the rack. He held it across his body, not at the ready, not in any tactical posture, but in the way a man holds an old tool he has not touched in a long time, but whose weight and balance he has never forgotten. And he worked the action twice slowly, listening to it. The bolt slid back and forward with the heavy mechanical authority of a weapon designed to function in mud and sand and rain and ice and every other condition the world could throw at it, and the sound it made was specific and clear, a metallic snick chunk that had a music to it, and Earl heard it the way a piano tuner hears a note, checking the thing against an internal standard that had been set a very long time ago and had never been recalibrated because it had never needed to be. He thumbed the rounds the Expo issued for the loaners. 7.62 NATO, 168 grain match, Sierra Match King hollow point boat tail, the same bullet that had been the standard for precision shooting for decades. The same bullet Earl had fired thousands of times in another life from another rifle in another place. He turned one in his fingers, examining the plot and the seating depth the way a man reads the date on a coin, checking the concentricity of the bullet in the case mouth, looking for the small imperfections in the manufacturing that could at 800 yards be the difference between a hit and a miss. The round was good. It was factory ammunition, consistent and reliable, and it would do. He pressed the rear aperture sight with his thumb and turned the elevation knob and counted the clicks under his breath. Each click was a quarter minute of angle, which at 800 yards was approximately 2 inches, and Earl was building his come-up from a number he carried in his head. Not in a book, not in an app, not in a data card taped to the stock of a rifle. In the place where certain men keep the things that once meant the difference between someone living and someone dying, the place that does not forget, because forgetting was never an option, because the numbers were written in a substance harder than ink and more permanent than paper. He knew the come-up for an M14 with 168 grain match ammunition at 800 yards in standard atmospheric conditions. He had known it for 57 years. He had known it in his sleep and in the dark and in the rain and in the middle of a firefight when the world was coming apart around him, and the only thing holding it together was the number in his head and the boy beside him who had put it there. And as his fingers settled onto the rifle, as the weapon found its place in his hands, the way a key finds a lock, it was cut for as the stock came into his shoulder, and the pistol grip filled his palm, and his trigger finger found the guard and rested along it in the position it had occupied 10,000 times before the tremor stopped. It simply stopped. The shaking that Tanner Briggs had smirked at, the faint unsteadiness that age had written into his hands over decades of mornings and coffee cups and garden hoses, and all the small civilian tasks that have nothing to do with the thing a man was built for, it was gone. It does that in some men when the thing in front of them is the thing they were built for. The body remembers what the body was made to do, and it rises to the occasion one more time. And the years fall away like a coat shrugged off, and underneath the coat, the man is the same man he was when the coat was first put on, and he is young again, or something close to it, something that has the steadiness of youth without the ignorance of it. Dana Whitfield saw it. She had been doing this long enough, and she had been a Marine herself long enough to know the difference between a man picking up a rifle and a rifle finding its way home. She said nothing, but she moved the spectators back an extra step, and when Tanner Briggs started in, again with something about dinosaurs and extinction events, she told him to step back behind the line or step off it, and her voice had an edge that shut the jokes down like a door closing on a room full of noise, and the noise was gone, and the silence that replaced it was the kind of silence that has weight and texture and meaning. The crowd got quiet, the particular kind of quiet that happens when a large number of people simultaneously sense that the ground is shifting under something, and they are not sure yet which way it is going to tilt, but they know that something is about to happen that will be worth having seen, and they do not want to miss it by making noise. Earl Maddox walked to the firing point with the borrowed rifle hanging easy in one hand, the muzzle down his finger outside the trigger guard, every movement carrying the unconscious discipline of a man who has handled weapons so long that safety is not a practice but a state of being, the way breathing is not a practice but a state of being. He stopped at the edge of the mat. He looked downrange. 800 yards of mowed field stretched out before him, long and flat, and alive with the small movements that most people never learn to see. The grass along the creek bottom swayed in its slow rhythm. The heat shimmer over the berm rippled and reformed. The plate hung on its chain at the far end, a tiny disk of steel in the vast green distance, swinging its slow arc. Left pause, right pause, patient, indifferent, unaware that it was about to become the most famous piece of steel in the long-range shooting world. Earl did not step onto the mat. He stepped past it, out into the open, into the wind itself, and he stood there in full view of 100 people and looked at the field the way a man looks at a letter he has been waiting his whole life to read. He looked at the grass and the mirage and the shimmer and the plate. He looked at the wind moving through the vegetation in pulses. The seed heads leaning left and standing straight and leaning left again. And he timed the pulses and he counted the interval and he watched the way the wind behaved differently at the creek bottom than it did at the midfield and differently at the midfield than it did at the target. 30 seconds. He stood there for 30 full seconds, and 30 seconds is a very long time when 100 people are watching you and one of them is laughing. He was not hesitating. Anyone who has ever done this for real, not on a range, not for sport, not for money or bragging rights or content for a channel, but for the reason that has no trophy at the end of it and no highlight reel and no sponsorship deal, will tell you exactly what he was doing. He was reading. He was reading the field the way a sailor reads the sea, the way a pilot reads the sky, the way a man who has learned to see the invisible learns to see it because the invisible was the thing that killed you or the thing that saved you. And the difference between the two was whether you took the time to look. He was watching the wind walk across that field in pulses and timing the lulls. He was reading the mirage and the grass and the shimmer and building a picture of the air between himself and that plate that no instrument on earth could have given him, because instruments measure the air where they stand, and the bullet has to fly through all the air in between, and the air in between is a river with currents and eddies and dead spots and surges, and the only way to read a river is to watch it flow. He was the only person on that firing line all weekend who was actually solving the problem instead of trusting a machine to solve it for him. And the problem was not the shot. The problem was the air. The shot was the easy part. The shot was muscle memory and trigger control and the mechanical act of sending a bullet down range. The air was the hard part. The air was the thing that turned a perfect shot into a miss. And the air could only be read by a man who had learned to read it, and the learning had cost more than any of the men on this line would ever know. Tanner Briggs said something to the man next to him. The man did not laugh. He was watching Earl's eyes, and what he saw in them was not the uncertainty of an old man out of his depth. What he saw was focus. The absolute consuming excludes everything else focus of a man who has entered the state that some people call flow and some people call the zone, and that Earl Maddox had never called anything because naming it would have required thinking about it, and thinking about it would have broken it. And then Earl Maddox came down into a sitting position right there on the open ground, and he ran the sling up his support arm into a loop, the hasty sling, the kind they do not teach much anymore because the world has moved on to bipods and bags and sand socks and all the wonderful expensive things that do the holding for you and free you from the ancient, difficult, deeply personal work of building a stable position out of nothing but your own body. He cinched the sling tight, wrapping it around his upper arm and through the loop of the rifle's sling. Swivel and the leather bit into his arm, and the rifle pulled tight against his shoulder, and he built a position out of bone and leather and 40-year-old muscle memory that was as solid as concrete and as natural as breathing. His left elbow found the pocket of his knee. The weight of the rifle settled into the triangle of bone, the arm and the leg, and the shoulder, forming a structure that was rigid not because it was tense, but because it was aligned the way an arch is rigid by geometry rather than by force. His breathing slowed. The rifle settled. The front sight post found the plate and held it, and the plate swung through the sight picture left, pause right, pause, and Earl let it swing. Watching the steel travel, learning its rhythm, the way he had learned the rhythm of the field, the way he had learned the rhythm of everything that mattered, which was by watching and waiting and refusing to hurry. 2 swings. 3. His finger moved onto the trigger, and you could see even from behind, even if you knew nothing about shooting at all, that this man was not going to chase the target. He was not going to track the plate and try to fire at the instant his sights crossed its center the way every other shooter on this line had tried and failed. He was going to do something else entirely, something older, something that predated the technology and the data books and the ballistic calculators and everything else that the modern world had built between a man and his target. He was going to put the bullet where the plate was going to be and let the world deliver the two of them to the same place at the same time. The wind leaned the grass and let it stand. He waited for it to stand. The rifle went off. It was not the sharp, theatrical crack of a competition rifle tuned for the crowd, the fast, aggressive bark of a short-barreled bolt gun firing a magnum cartridge designed to impress. It was the flat, workmanlike report of a battle rifle doing what it was designed to do, sending a piece of copper-jacketed lead downrange at 2,800 feet per second with no apology and no flourish. The sound of a tool being used by a man who understood it, and the recoil moved through Earl, the way a wave moves through a pier absorbed by the structure and gone. For about a second and a half, there was nothing. 800 yards is far enough that the bullet has to fly for a noticeable, terrible little while. A full breath's worth of silence in which the round is out there in the air alone. Riding the wind, it was borne into, climbing its arc through the first 400 yards and falling through the second 400, shedding velocity and gathering gravity, and every pair of eyes on that firing line is locked on a 10-inch disc of steel that does not know what is coming, that hangs on its chain and swings its indifferent swing and catches the sun, the way it has caught the sun all weekend. And the man who sent the bullet has already done everything he can do, has already made every decision and executed every action and committed every ounce of his skill and his experience and his memory to the shot. And now he has to wait like everyone else for the universe to show its math. Nobody breathed. The silence was not the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of 100 people who had stopped being individuals and had become for that second and a half a single organism with a single focus, a single hope, a single held breath. They did not know why they wanted the old man to hit the plate. They did not know him. They did not know his name or his story or the reason he had driven 400 miles to be here, but something in the way he had stood in the open and read the field, something in the way his hands had stopped shaking, something in the 30 seconds of silence and the sling in the sitting position and the unhurried, absolute confidence of a man who was not performing but simply doing the thing he knew how to do had shifted the crowd from spectators to witnesses. And witnesses do not breathe until the verdict is in. Then the steel rang. It was not a clean center hit. It was the off-center gong of a plate struck, while it is moving a wild, ringing, unmistakable sound that split the afternoon in two, the chain jumping and snapping taut, and the disc spinning hard on its hanger and catching the sunlight in rapid strobing flashes as it whipped around, and the sound came rolling back up the field to the firing line, a beat after they saw the plate jump, because sound is slower than light, and 800 yards is enough distance to prove it, and in that beat, in that fraction of a second between the visual confirmation and the auditory one, the crowd existed in a state of pure, suspended disbelief. And then the sound arrived, and the disbelief broke, and the crowd made a noise that started as a gasp and climbed through astonishment and became something that had no name in English or in any other language. A sound that was not a cheer and not a roar, and not a shout, but something more elemental. The sound a group of human beings makes when they understand all at the same instant that they have just watched something they will be telling other people about for the rest of their lives. One cold shot, open sights, a borrowed rifle nobody else had wanted, a swinging plate that 143 men with better equipment and younger eyes and every technological advantage the modern world could offer had not been able to touch. An old man in a faded ball cap who had driven 400 miles in a truck with an AM radio and had stood in the open and read the grass for 30 seconds and had done the thing that the technology and the money and the youth could not do. Earl Maddox came off the rifle. He cleared the action with practiced economy bolt-back, chamber check magazine, out the movements automatic performed by hands that had done them so many times the hands no longer needed the brain's permission or the brain's attention. And he set the M1A down on the mat with both hands carefully, gently, the way you set down something borrowed. That you respect the way you set down a thing that has just done something it did not have to do, but did anyway because you asked it to. And he stood up, and his knees told him about every one of his 79 years as they straightened the cartilage and the joints protesting the transition from sitting to standing with the particular eloquence of a body that has been used hard and maintained carefully and is running on the last of its original parts. He did not pump his fist. He did not turn to the crowd. He did not look at Tanner Briggs. He did not raise his arms or shout or do any of the things that men do when they have won, because Earl Maddox had not won anything. Winning was not what he had come here to do. He looked down a range at the plate, still swinging on his chain, ringing slower now, the sound fading from a shout to a whisper to a hum, and something moved across his face that was not triumph and was not pride and was not satisfaction. It looked a lot more like remembering. The way a man looks when he hears a song from a time he has tried very hard not to think about, and the song finds him anyway. And for a moment, he is not here at all, but back in the place where the song first meant something. Earl stood there at the edge of the firing point, and he was not in Texas. He was somewhere far away and long ago, and the steel ringing down range was another sound, entirely the sound of a bullet finding its mark in a valley where the stakes were not money, but men. And the field in front of him was a different field, and the wind was a wind that had carried things no one should have to remember. He blinked, and he was back. And he was old again, and the crowd was making noise, and he looked a little confused by all of it, the way a man who has been alone for a long time looks confused when the world suddenly turns to face him, because the world facing him was not something he had asked for or wanted, and the attention of 100 people was a weight he had not prepared to carry. Dana Whitfield had her hand pressed to her mouth, not in shock because Dana Whitfield was not a woman who was easily shocked. In recognition. She had been a Marine herself, 20 years of service, before she retired to run ranges and teach civilians the things she had learned in uniform, and she had seen something in the way Earl built his position that she had not seen in person in over a decade. The hasty sling, the bone support, the sitting position built for the field, not for the range. The way he read the wind off the grass instead of a meter. She knew what she had just watched, even if she did not yet know who she had just watched do it. She knew that the man who had just hit that plate was not a hobbyist who had gotten lucky. He was something else entirely, something older and rarer. And the last time she had seen someone build a position like that was in a classroom at Quantico, where the instructor had shown them a photograph from 1969 and said, "This is how it used to be done, and if you are ever in a situation where your equipment fails and your meters die and your data is gone, this is how you will do it again." The crowd pressed forward. Hands reached out. Someone was trying to get a photograph with a phone held at arm's length. Someone else was asking Earl his name, asking where he was from, asking what rifle he normally shot, asking how long he had been shooting, asking all the rapid-fire questions that people ask when they are trying to build a story out of something they do not understand, yet trying to fit the extraordinary into the ordinary categories of their experience. Earl answered none of them. He was looking for something in the crowd, and when he did not find it, he stopped looking and simply stood still, the way a tree stands still when the wind dies, not because it has anywhere to go, but because standing still is what it does. The attention washed over him and around him, and he was unmoved by it, not because he was rude or dismissive, but because he had no use for it. The attention was for someone else. The shot had been for someone else. Everything that had just happened had been for someone else, someone who was not here and would never be here again. And the crowd's excitement, however genuine, was noise in a frequency that Earl could not receive. And then from the VIP tent at the back of the range, walking fast with the particular stride of a man who has spent 30 years walking with purpose, who has walked across parade decks, in firing ranges, in briefing rooms, in desert flats, in mountain trails, and every other surface the Marine Corps could put under his boots, came Reuben Greer. Greer was 62 years old, retired Marine Sergeant Major, 30 years of service. The kind of career that gets summarized in award citations and spoken about in reverent shorthand at mess nights and retirement ceremonies. 3 combat deployments, a Silver Star, a Purple Heart that he never mentioned because the wound had been minor, and the men who had been wounded worse did not mention theirs. His name was on half the marksmanship doctrine the younger competitors on this line had grown up reciting. He had written the chapter on reading environmental conditions for the Scout Sniper Manual, the chapter that every student at the school had to memorize, the chapter that began with the words, "The wind is not a number, the wind is a story, and the shooter's first job is to learn to read it." He had trained more shooters than most men had met. He had stood behind more firing lines than most men had seen. He was the Expo's headline guest, the man whose photograph was on the banner above the VIP tent, and he had been giving a seminar on advanced marksmanship to a tent full of paying attendees, when a young range officer, a kid named Peters, who had been on the Expo staff for 3 years and had never run anywhere in the line of duty, came through the tent flap at something very close to a sprint and said 5 words that emptied the tent behind him. "Old guy, irons, 800, first round." Greer had walked out of his own seminar mid-sentence. He had been discussing the relationship between mirage reading and wind estimation, and he had been mid-sentence on a point about vegetation as a wind indicator, And he had stopped speaking and stood up and gone because there are certain combinations of words that to a man who has spent his life in this world function not as information, but as a summons, and this particular combination was a summons he had been waiting his entire career to receive. He came up the firing line through the crowd and people moved for him, the way they do for a man whose authority is not worn on his sleeve, but built into the way he carries himself, into the set of his shoulders, and the steadiness of his gaze, and the economy of his movement, all of it communicating a single unambiguous message, which was that this man was going somewhere important, and you would do well to let him get there. He stopped about 10 feet short of Earl Maddox, and he looked at him. It was not the look of a man who was impressed by a trick shot. It was not the look of a man who had seen something entertaining or surprising or noteworthy. It was the look of a man seeing something he had only read about. The look of a historian standing in front of the original document after years of studying the copies. The look of a student meeting the teacher whose work he has been studying for decades without knowing the teacher was still alive, without knowing the teacher was anything more than a name in a footnote and a technique in a manual and a story told by a grandmother in a kitchen in Oklahoma. Greer looked at Earl's hands. He looked at the M1A on the mat. He looked at the way Earl had positioned himself relative to the wind, angled, not squared the left shoulder forward, the body turned to present the minimum profile to the crosswind, the way the old manuals described, and nobody practiced anymore because nobody needed to practice it when they had wind meters and ballistic apps that did the compensating for them. He looked at the ground where Earl had stood for 30 seconds reading the grass, and he understood with the certainty of a man who had written the manual on that exact technique, who had spent his entire career teaching other men to do the thing he had just watched this man do, that he was standing in front of the man who had invented it, not learned it, not been taught it, invented it, created it out of necessity and desperation and the raw material of a situation where there was no technology and no support and no margin for error, where the only tools available were a pair of eyes and a field of grass and the willingness to trust what you saw over what you were told. "Say your name," Greer said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It carried the way quiet voices do when every person within earshot has stopped making sound, the way a whisper carries in a cathedral, not because the whisper is powerful, but because the silence is absolute. "Maddox," Earl said. "Earl Maddox." Greer said the whole name slowly, the way you say a word you have only ever seen written down and are hearing spoken for the first time. The way you say a name you have been carrying in your memory for decades and have never been sure you were pronouncing correctly because you learned it from a woman who cried every time she said it, and the crying made the consonants soft. He was checking it against something, a name in a footnote, a name in a citation, a name in a story he had been told so many times as a child that it had become part of the architecture of his memory, load-bearing structural, the kind of thing you cannot remove without the whole building shifting. "Scout Sniper Platoon," Greer said. "7th Marines, that valley in 69. Earl did not confirm it. He did not deny it. He stood there with his hands at his sides, and the tremor was back in them now, the steadiness of the shot already fading like a tide going out, the body returning to its age now that the thing it had risen for was done, and he looked at Reuben Greer with an expression that contained 57 years of silence. Not the silence of a man who has nothing to say, the silence of a man who has everything to say and has chosen not to say it because the saying would require opening a door that he closed a long time ago and has spent every day since then standing in front of with his back against it, holding it shut. Greer turned around to face the crowd, to face Tanner Briggs specifically, who had gone the color of old newspaper, the blood draining from his face, the way water drains from a tub when the plug is pulled slowly and then all at once. And Reuben Greer, who had spent his career training men to do impossible things with rifles, who had spent his life in the service of precision and discipline and the hard, unforgiving craft of putting a bullet exactly where it needed to go, began to speak about a man who had done an impossible thing before any of them were born. He told them about a time before data books, before weather meters, before ballistic calculators and smartphones and apps that could tell you the Coriolis drift of the Earth's rotation on a bullet at 1,000 yards. A time when a small number of men in a very bad place learned to read the wind off the grass and the mirage off the heat because there was nothing else to read it with, because the technology did not exist, because the situation did not allow for it, because the only instruments available were the ones God had given them, which were eyes and experience, and the kind of patience that can only be learned in the places where impatience gets you killed. He told them that these men learned their craft not in classrooms or on ranges, but in the field, in the actual, literal, specific field, lying in the grass and the mud and the rain for hours and days, watching the world move around them, learning to see the things that move too slowly for most people to notice, the way heat bends the air above a road, the way wind moves through a stand of trees differently than it moves across open ground, the way the grass tells you everything the wind is doing if you are patient enough to watch it and smart enough to understand what it is saying. He told them that lives, not trophies, not money, not bragging rights on the internet, lives human lives, the lives of young men who had mothers and fathers and sisters and girlfriends and dogs and favorite songs and plans for afterlives were stacked on whether these men read the wind correctly, and the reading was done with nothing but eyes and grass and the accumulated wisdom of men who had gotten it wrong enough times to know what getting it right looked like. He told them about the spring of 1969, about a valley overseas that most Americans had stopped thinking about long before the men in it had stopped dying, about a rifle company that had moved into low ground on a routine patrol and had walked into an ambush fire from three sides, coordinated and devastating, the kind of ambush that is designed not to pin a unit, but to destroy it, to cut it off from support and dismantle it piece by piece in the low ground, where no helicopter can reach and no artillery can help, and the only thing between you and the end is whatever you have with you. He told them about a scout sniper team on a ridgeline above that company. Two men, a shooter and a spotter, a rifle and a pair of binoculars and a radio that was not working, and a position that was exposed, in a situation that was as desperate as situations get. The company below them was being taken apart. Men were dying. The fire was coming from a position that the company could not see and could not reach a heavy weapon that was doing the killing methodically, the way a man with a scythe works a field, one pass at a time, left to right, and the company was the wheat. He told them that the shooter on that team had read the wind the way Earl Maddox had read it today, off the grass, off the vegetation, timing the pulses in the lulls, building a picture of the air between himself and a target that was beyond the effective range of his weapon, beyond the distance that the manual said was possible, beyond what any reasonable assessment of the situation would have called a shot. And he had made the shot, in shifting crosswind, with iron sights, on a target that was partially concealed and partially moving, and the shot had found its mark. And the shot had broken the ambush. The fire had stopped. The company had reorganized. The company had moved. The company had walked out of that valley, not all of them, not without cost, but alive, most of them, because a man on a ridge line had read the grass and trusted what it told him, and sent a bullet into the wind and let the wind carry it where it needed to go. Greer's voice was steady and clear, the voice of a man who had briefed generals and trained thousands, who had stood in front of audiences of every size and composition, and had spoken with the same measured authoritative precision, regardless of whether he was addressing a Senate committee or a room full of boot lieutenants. And he used that voice now with the same care he used for everything else, because what he was saying mattered in a way that most things he said did not, and the mattering required the voice to be right. He told them that the technique Earl Maddox had used, reading terrain wind through vegetation movement, timing the shot to the natural lull in the wind cycle using the grass and the mirage and the heat shimmer to build a three-dimensional picture of the atmosphere along the bullet's path, had been documented afterward at the Marine Scout Sniper School at Quantico. That it had been written down by an instructor who had heard about it from a man who had been in the company that walked out of that valley, a man who had watched the shot from the low ground and had never forgotten the sound of the rifle on the ridge and the silence that followed it, the sudden stunning silence of a battle ending, because one man on a hill had done the thing that all the other men in all the other positions could not do. That the technique had been codified and taught and passed down through generations of shooters. That it had become doctrine. That it had been incorporated into the curriculum at every level of military marksmanship instruction, from the basic course to the advanced course to the instructor course that Greer himself had attended and eventually taught. That every man on this firing line who had ever been instructed to watch the grass, to read the mirage, to time the wind, to build a wind picture from natural indicators rather than from instruments, had been taught a thing that this exact human being, this man standing here in a faded ball cap and an oversized windbreaker, had bled to learn in a place where getting it wrong meant men did not come home. He told them that the spotter on that team, the man who had called Earl Maddox's win for 9 months, who had lain beside him on ridge lines and in ditches and in the tall grass at the edges of fields that looked a lot like this one, who had read the range and calculated the windage and given Earl the numbers that let him do the shooting, was a 19-year-old corporal named Jimmy Pruitt, and that Corporal Pruitt did not come home. The crowd was silent, not the uncomfortable silence of people who do not know what to say, and not the polite silence of people who are waiting for a speaker to finish so they can applaud. It was the heavy pressing silence of people who are beginning to understand that they are standing inside a story much larger than the one they thought they had come to see, a story theory that reaches back decades and forward into the future and down into the ground where a 19-year-old boy is buried, and up into the sky where the wind still blows and the grass still moves and the world still turns indifferent to all of it. And then Reuben Greer's voice did a thing it almost never did in front of an audience. It dropped. It roughened. The professional veneer, the polished surface that 30 years of briefings and seminars and public speaking had built over the raw material of the man underneath, cracked. And underneath it was something that was not professional at all. It was personal. It was old. It was the voice of a boy who had grown up in a house in Oklahoma where a photograph on a mantle was the center of gravity, and a story told by a grandmother was the origin of everything. He told them that he knew all of this not from books, not from archives, not from the institutional memory of the Marine Corps or the records at the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis. He knew it for one simple reason. Jimmy Pruitt was his uncle, the 19-year-old corporal who had called the wind for Earl Maddox, who had done the math while Earl did the shooting, who had lain beside him in the grass and read the field and given him the numbers that saved a company of Marines. That young man had been his mother's older brother, his grandmother's firstborn son, the boy whose photograph sat on a mantle in a house in Tulsa, two young men in front of a sandbag position, one grinning and one not, and the one who was grinning had been 19 and would be 19 forever because 19 was as old as the world had let him get. Greer told them that his grandmother had kept that photograph on her mantle for as long as he could remember, that it was the first thing she touched in the morning and the last thing she looked at before she turned off the lights, that the frame was silver and the glass was always clean, and the photograph had faded to amber at the edges from the sunlight that came through the front window in the afternoon, and his grandmother would not move it because the afternoon light was the light her son had liked best, and who was she to take it from him now? He told them that his grandmother had told the story so many times it became a kind of scripture in their house, a sacred text that was recited and repeated and handed down with the weight and the gravity of something that must not be forgotten. The story of the quiet man who had carried her son off that hill when it was over, who had brought the body back himself because he would not leave his spotter for the detail to collect, because the spotter was not a body to him. The spotter was Jimmy, and you do not leave Jimmy on a hill. Who had shown up at the funeral in Oklahoma in a uniform that still had red dirt on it because he had driven straight from the base without stopping 18 hours on the road, and he had stood at the back of the church and said nothing to anyone and left before the reception and driven away and never come back. And that was the last time anyone in the family had seen Earl Maddox. He had disappeared. He had vanished into the country the way certain men do when the thing they have survived is too large to carry in a place where people might see it, when the weight of what happened is so heavy that the only way to bear it is to bear it alone in silence in a place where no one knows your name and no one asks about the shaking in your hands. Greer's grandmother had looked for him. She had written letters to the last address the Marine Corps had on file, and the letters came back unopened. She had called, and the number was disconnected. She had asked the Corps, and the Corps had said he was out discharged, no forwarding address, and there was nothing they could do, because a man who has served his time has earned the right to go wherever he wants, including away. Greer himself had looked years later, when he was old enough to understand what he was looking for and why. He had found a name in the records and a citation with most of the details redacted, in a trail that went cold in Oklahoma, in a small town where nobody by that name was listed, and nobody at the post office remembered the name, and the trail ended the way trails end, when the man at the end of them does not want to be found. And Greer had stopped looking, not because he did not care, because he cared enough to understand that some men do not want to be found, and a man who carries another man's son off a hill has earned the right to be left alone if that is what he wants. You do not chase a man who has given that much. You honor the distance the way you would honor a request. You leave the door open and you stop knocking. But Greer had never stopped teaching the technique. Every class he ran, every generation of snipers he trained, every time he stood on a firing line and watched the wind move through a field, he taught them to read the grass. He taught them the way his uncle's partner had done it, the way the manual described it, the way it was done before there were meters and apps and all the wonderful things that worked beautifully until they didn't. Until the batteries died or the satellite signal was lost or the meter fell off the pack in the middle of a movement and you were left with nothing but your eyes and the grass and the wind, and then the technique was the only thing standing between you and a miss that might cost someone their life. And in the margins of his instructor's notes, in the handwriting he used for things that mattered, he had written a name that none of his students ever asked about, but that he said to himself every time he stood on a firing line and watched the wind move through a field. He said it the way a prayer is said, not because the words have power, but because the saying of them is an act of remembrance, and remembrance is the only form of resurrection available to the living. Earl Maddox. Greer stopped talking. The silence held for a long moment the way silence holds after the last note of something important, after the last line of a eulogy, after the last echo of taps at a graveside, and nobody broke it because nobody wanted to be the first to make a sound that was smaller than what had just been said, and every sound available to them was smaller. Tanner Briggs had taken off his cap without seeming to know he had done it. His face was not red anymore. It was white, the white of a man who has just understood that the thing he mocked was the thing he should have been kneeling in front of that. The old man he had laughed at was the living root of the tree. He had been climbing his whole career, and that every shot he had ever taken and every technique he had ever learned and every word in every manual he had ever read had passed through the hands and the mind and the sacrifice of the man he had compared to a bingo player. His eyes were wet. He was not trying to hide it. Whether that was shame or something deeper, something closer to the cracking of a foundation that had been built on assumptions that turned out to be wrong, was a question only Tanner Briggs could answer, and he would spend a long time answering it. Earl Maddox stood still through all of it. He had not moved. He had not looked away or looked down or shown any of the reactions that a man is supposed to show when his history is being spoken aloud in front of strangers, when the private things he has kept private for 57 years are suddenly in the air, and in the ears and in the eyes of people he does not know. He looked at Reuben Greer the way he had looked at the field, steadily reading it, taking the measure of it, and when Greer finished, Earl nodded once. Just once. The way you nod when someone has finally said the thing you have been carrying alone for 57 years, and you do not have to carry it alone anymore, but you are not yet sure what that feels like because you have been carrying it so long that the weight has become part of your structure, and you do not know if the structure will hold without it. The wind picked up across the range, and the plate at 800 yards began to swing wider on its chain, catching the late afternoon light in slow flashes. Nobody was watching it anymore. Every eye on that firing line was on two men standing 10 feet apart, separated by half a century of silence, and connected by a 19-year-old who had been dead longer than he had been alive. Dana Whitfield moved first. She had been standing with the M1A still in her awareness, and the clipboard still in her hand, and the professional composure of a woman who had managed crises larger than this, but the composure was a thin shell over something that was working hard to get through, and her eyes were bright and her jaw was set the way jaws set when the alternative is letting them tremble. She walked to the platform where the locked plexiglass case sat in the sun. She picked it up with both hands. She brought it to Earl Maddox and set it down on the table in front of him and opened it. $25,000. Banded, neat, real. The kind of money that changes things for a man who drives a truck with 327,000 miles on it and lives in a two-bedroom house and eats ham sandwiches on wax paper and has not bought a new piece of clothing since his wife died. The kind of money that could fix the truck or replace it. The kind of money that could pay for the things that old age brings, the doctor visits and the prescriptions and the small repairs to a house that is aging at the same rate as the man who lives in it. Earl looked at the money. He looked at it the way he had looked at the field carefully, thoroughly, completely, the way he looked at everything, because Earl Maddox was a man who looked at things before he decided what to do about them. And what he did was never hasty and never impulsive and never, not once in 79 years, anything other than exactly what he intended. And then he looked up at Dana Whitfield and he asked her a question. He asked it very politely, the way a man asks who was raised to say sir and ma'am and please and thank you, who was raised by a carpenter in eastern Oklahoma who believed that manners were not optional and that the way you asked for a thing was as important as the thing you were asking for, and who had never seen a reason to stop being polite just because the world had stopped being polite around him. He asked her if the expo could see to it that the entire amount, all of it, every dollar, went to the scholarship fund at the Scout Sniper Association, the one that put the children and grandchildren of fallen Marines through school, the one that took the money and turned it into textbooks and tuition and dorm rooms, and the particular transformative opportunity of an education paid for by the sacrifice of a man who did not get to have one himself. Dana opened her mouth and closed it. She opened it again and no sound came out. She was a woman who had managed a firing line for 15 years and had dealt with every kind of person and every kind of situation and had never been at a loss for words, and she was at a loss for words. Earl said there was a young woman, Jimmy's great-niece Greer's cousin's daughter, starting college in the fall. He said he had read about it in the association's newsletter, which he still received at his address in Oklahoma, because some subscriptions, like some promises, he simply never canceled. The newsletter came every quarter, and he read it cover to cover the way he read everything, slowly and completely. And he had seen the notice about the young woman, and he had thought about it, and the thought had been part of the reason he had driven 400 miles. Though not the only part and not the most important part, because the most important part was the thing that could not be put into words and did not need to be. He said he did not know the young woman's name. He had not looked it up. He had not tried to contact her or the family. That was not his place. He knew she was Jimmy's people, and that was enough. And then Earl Maddox said the most words anyone heard him say all day. Jimmy was always better with numbers than me. I just did the shooting. Jimmy did the math. He'd have gotten a real kick out of seeing all these fancy rigs get shown up by a loner and a set of irons. He said it quietly, almost to himself, the way you say things to people who are not there, the way you talk to the dead. When you forget for a moment that they are dead, or when you remember and do it anyway because the talking is not for them, it is for you. It is the thread that keeps you connected to a person who is gone, and if you stop talking, the thread breaks and the person drifts away, and you are alone in a way that is worse than any other kind of alone. And the ghost of something that might have been a smile crossed his face for the first time all day. Not a happy smile, not the smile of a man who has won. The private, aching, beautiful smile of a man who is sharing a joke with someone who is not there to laugh at it, but who would have laughed, who would have thrown his head back and laughed the way only a 19-year-old can laugh, with his whole body, with the full-throated, unreserved joy of a boy who has not yet learned to hold anything back, and the laughter would have echoed across the firing line and bounced off the tents and startled the birds out of the trees, and Earl would have shaken his head and said something about noise, discipline, and Jimmy would have laughed harder. The crowd had gone so still that you could hear the plate creaking on its chain 800 yards away. Somewhere in the back, a man cleared his throat, and it sounded like a gunshot. A woman in the second row was crying without making any noise at all, just tears running down her face and dripping off her jaw and falling onto the front of her shirt. And she was not wiping them because she did not seem to know they were there. Or she did know and she did not care, because some tears are not embarrassing. Some tears are the correct response to the thing that is happening, and wiping them would be disrespectful to the thing that caused them. Reuben Greer took a step forward, then another. He closed the distance between himself and Earl Maddox, and he stopped in front of him, and for a moment neither of them moved. Two men who had been shaped by the same ghost, who had been orbiting the same absence for decades without knowing the other was out there, who had built their lives around the same 19-year-old boy, one by carrying the guilt and the other by carrying the gratitude, standing face to face in the Texas sun with the smell of gun oil and cut grass and the distant sound of the flag snapping on the pole above the VIP tent. Greer extended his hand. Earl took it, The grip held for a long time longer than a handshake, not as long as everything it meant. And while they held it, something passed between them that was not words, because words are too small for some things. It was understanding. The understanding of a man who has carried a weight, meeting a man who knows what the weight is, and the meeting does not remove the weight, but it changes the nature of it. It shifts it from something you bear alone to something that is known, and known things are lighter than unknown things, not because they weigh less, but because the knowing distributes them differently. And while they held the handshake, Greer leaned in and said something that only Earl could hear. Something private, something that belonged to the two of them and to the boy who had been 19 and had called the wind and had loved numbers and had not come home. And whatever it was, it found the place in Earl that the 57 years of silence had built a wall around. And it did not break the wall, because some walls are structural, and breaking them would bring the whole building down. But it opened a door in the wall, a small door just wide enough for the words to pass through. Earl's jaw tightened. He nodded once, the same single nod, the nod that was his entire vocabulary for the things that mattered most. And when they released each other's hands, there was something different in his eyes. Not peace exactly. Earl Maddox was not a man who would ever be fully at peace. The valley and the boy and the shot and the carrying, these were not things that peace could reach, but something adjacent to peace, something in the neighborhood, something that happens when a weight you have been carrying shifts not off your shoulders, but into a position where the load is shared, where the bones of another man's understanding help you bear what your own bones have been bearing alone. The crowd began to move. People were talking, but quietly, the way you talk in a church or at a graveside or in the room where someone has just said something that changed the way you see the world. The spell of the thing held. Nobody was shouting or cheering or doing any of the things crowds normally do when a spectacle ends, because what they had witnessed was not a spectacle. It was a reckoning. And reckonings require a different kind of silence, the kind that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something larger than sound. And then Tanner Briggs walked through them. He came forward slowly, his cap still in his hands, held the way men hold caps at funerals by the brim, turning it slowly in fingers that do not know what else to do. His face carrying the wreckage of a man whose entire understanding of what he was doing and why he was doing it had been dismantled in the space of 15 minutes, and who had not yet begun to build a new one. He stopped in front of Earl Maddox, and he did not speak. He could not speak. Everything he had said earlier, the bingo line, the VFW line, the dinosaur jokes, the hip replacement comments, the Denny's crack, all the small cutting, clever things he had said to make the crowd laugh and to make himself feel large, was hanging in the air around him like smoke from a fire he could not put out. And the shame of it was doing the talking for him, and the shame was more eloquent than he had ever been. He held out his hand. Earl Maddox looked at it. He looked at the hand and then at the young man attached to it, the sponsor's logos, the gym muscles, the online following the podcast, the expensive rifle, all the armor that Tanner Briggs had built around himself to prove that he mattered, to prove that he belonged, to prove that the thing he did had value and that he was good at it, and that the goodness entitled him to the attention and the money and the platform. And what Earl saw was not an enemy and not a fool and not the man who had laughed at him in front of 100 people. What Earl saw was a young man, that was all. A young man who did not yet know what the world was going to ask of him, and who, if he was lucky, might never have to learn the things that Earl had learned, and if he was unlucky, would learn them all at once and in the dark, and would need someone to tell him afterward that carrying the weight was not the same as being crushed by it, that you could carry it and still live, that you could carry it and still water the garden, that you could carry it and still eat ham sandwiches and drive an old truck and read the paper at the end of the counter and be invisible. And the invisibility was not a defeat. It was a choice, and the choice was not weakness. It was the particular strength of a man who has nothing left to prove and everything left to protect. Earl shook his hand firmly, without hesitation and without performance. The way you shake the hand of someone you have decided to forgive before they even know they need forgiving, because forgiveness is not something you do for the person who wronged you. It is something you do so the thing you are carrying gets 1 ounce lighter, and at 79, 1 ounce is worth the effort. Tanner Briggs nodded a small nod. Not Earl's nod, not the nod of a man who has processed the thing and filed it, but the nod of a man who is still processing, who will be processing for a long time. And he turned and walked back into the crowd, and he would go home that night and sit in his truck in his own driveway for a long time before going inside, and the lights would be on in the house, and his wife would be visible through the kitchen window doing the things she did in the evening, and Tanner would sit in the truck and look at the steering wheel and think about a man whose hands shook until they held a rifle and then did not shake at all, and he would think about what that meant, and the thinking would take a while. He would not post anything on social media for 11 days, which was the longest silence his 80,000 followers had ever known, and some of them would message him asking if he was okay, and he would not answer because he was not sure yet whether he was okay or whether okay was even the right word for what he was becoming, which was something different than the thing he had been, something humbler, something that had been broken in a specific place and would heal stronger in that place, the way bones do. And when he finally did post it, would be a photograph of an M10 lying on a firing mat, the borrowed rifle, the one nobody had wanted, and the caption would be a single sentence that read, "I met a man today who taught me I don't know a goddamn thing." It would be the most shared post he ever made. It would be shared by veterans and shooters and people who had never held a rifle in their lives, shared by people who understood exactly what it meant, and people who understood only that it meant something. And Tanner Briggs would never explain it, not on his podcast, not in his videos, not in the interviews that followed, because some lessons are not content. Some lessons are private. Some lessons are between you and the man who taught them, and the silence in which the teaching occurred. Earl picked the borrowed rifle up from the mat. He checked it one more time, action, clear bore clear, sling untangled, the way you check a borrowed thing before you return it, because returning it clean and correct is the last thing you can do for a thing that did something for you. And he handed it to Dana Whitfield stock first, because a thing you borrow you return clean, and you return it the right way around, and you look the person in the eye when you do it, and he had been taught that by his father, who had been a carpenter in eastern Oklahoma and had never touched a rifle in his life, but who understood that respect for borrowed things was not about the things. It was about the borrowing. It was about the understanding that everything you hold has been entrusted to you by someone or something, and the way you treat it tells the world what kind of man you are. Dana took the rifle and held it, and she looked at Earl Maddox, and the professional composure was gone now. Just gone, replaced by the face of a woman who had served and who understood what service, awesome, and who was standing in front of a man who had paid a price she could not calculate. "Thank you for your service, Mr. Maddox," she said. Earl looked at her, and for just a moment his eyes flickered, not with gratitude, not with the practiced acceptance that veterans learn to deploy when civilians say those words, the slight nod and the half smile and the thank you in return. That becomes automatic after you hear it enough times, and that means less each time, because the words are a formula, and formulas do not carry weight. What flickered in his eyes was something unguarded and old and deep, something that had been behind the wall for 57 years and was now standing in the doorway that Greer's whispered words had opened. "Don't thank me," he said. "Thank Jimmy. He's the one who did the hard part." And Dana Whitfield, who had been a Marine who had served 20 years, who had run firing lines and trained shooters and seen every kind of man stand behind a rifle, who had stood at attention at funerals and folded flags and handed them to mothers and watched the mothers hold them against their chests, the way you hold a thing that is all you have left of the thing you loved most, squeezed the M1A in her hands and pressed her lips together and nodded because she understood exactly what he meant. The hard part was not the shooting. The hard part was not the wind or the distance or the plate or the pressure. The hard part was being 19 and lying in the grass beside a man with a rifle and calling his wind and doing his math and knowing that every number you gave him was a life or a death, and getting every number right for 9 months and being killed on the last day anyway. The hard part was being the one who did not come home. The expo closed at 6. The vendors took down their banners. The coffee stands shut off their machines. The last shooters packed their gear into hard cases and wheeled them across the gravel lot to trucks and SUVs that started on the first try and had air conditioning and satellite radio and GPS systems that knew every road between here and wherever home was. The sun dropped low and orange over the Texas flat, and the shadows of the tents stretched long and thin across the mowed grass like dark fingers reaching for the firing line. And the wind died the way it dies in the evening. In that part of the country, gradually and then all at once, the grass going still, The flags going limp, the world holding its breath the way it does in the space between day and night. Earl Maddox walked to his truck alone. He walked the way he always walked, steady, unhurried, with the particular economy of motion of a man who had spent most of his life trying to leave as small a footprint as possible, who had learned to move through the world without disturbing it, without drawing the attention of the world to himself, because the world's attention was a thing he had no use for and had never sought. He opened the truck door. The hinge protested the way it always did, a metallic creak that was not quite a squeal and not quite a groan, but something in between that Maggie used to say sounded like the truck was sighing, and Earl had always thought that was exactly right, the truck sighing, because the truck was old and tired and had been opening this door for 26 years and would like very much to stop, but would not, because stopping was not something the truck or the man who drove it did. He sat down on the bench seat in the sag that his body had worn into the foam over 26 years of mornings and errands and trips to the hardware store and drives to the barber and all the thousand small journeys that make up a life lived in one place. He pulled the door shut and sat for a moment in the quiet. The photograph was still on the passenger seat. Two young men, a sandbag position, a valley falling away, one grinning, one not. Earl picked it up. He held it in both hands and his thumbs made small circles on the edges of it, the way they always did, wearing the paper a little thinner each time, the edges soft now from decades of handling, the image fading a little more each year, the colors bleeding into each other, the way colors do when time and light and touch conspire to take them. And someday the photograph would be nothing but a pale square of paper with no image at all. But that day was not today. And today the grin was still there, and the binoculars were still there, and the boy was still 19 and still squinting against the light and still alone in the amber world of the photograph, if nowhere else. 25,000, Earl said to the empty cab. Can you believe that, Jimmy? $25,000 for one round. You'd have had something smart to say about that, something about the math, something about the cost per round and the return on investment. You always did love the numbers. The cab was quiet. The cab was always quiet. Earl talked to Jimmy in the truck sometimes on the long drives when the AM radio faded to static and the highway was straight and empty, and the solitude opened up inside him like a room, and in the room was the boy with the grin, and the boy was always listening, and the boy never answered, but the not answering was its own kind of answer, the answer of a presence that does not need words because the words were all said a long time ago, and the saying of them was enough. The truck started on the second try. The engine knocked and settled into its familiar rattle, the particular diesel and gasoline sound of an engine that was burning oil and would continue to burn oil until it stopped running entirely, which would happen someday. And on that day, Earl would either fix it or he would not. And either way, the truck would have done its job, which was to carry him where he needed to go for as long as he needed to go there. He put it in gear and pulled out of the lot and turned north onto the highway. And the Expo shrank in his mirrors, until it was just a cluster of white shapes in the amber light, the tents and the banners and the flags, and the firing line where a plate still hung on its chain, no longer swinging. Still now, and the silence of the plate was louder than the ringing had been, because the ringing had been a sound and the silence was a meaning. He drove home the way he had come. 400 miles, both hands on the wheel, AM radio pulling in stations that faded in and out, like memories, a country song, here a preacher's there, a weather report for a county he was passing through and would never pass through again. The sound rising and falling and rising and falling, the way the grass had moved in the field, in pulses, in rhythms, and Earl listened to the radio, the way he listened to everything with the full patient attention of a man who believed that the world was always telling you something, and the trick was being quiet enough to hear it. He did not stop for food because the second ham sandwich was still in the wax paper on the seat, and he ate it somewhere between Denton and the Oklahoma border, driving with one hand for the few minutes it took to eat, the only time in the entire trip. His left hand left the wheel, and the sandwich tasted the way it always tasted, like mustard and lettuce and bread, and the particular flavor of a thing made with love by a woman who was dead and kept alive by the repetition of the recipe she invented. The thermos was empty, but that was all right because he was not thirsty. He was something else entirely. He was the thing a man becomes when he has done the last thing he came to do, and the road ahead has no particular destination except the place where he sleeps and the garden that needs watering on Tuesday. He was finished, not finished with life, not finished with the garden or the truck or the mornings at the diner or the visits to the barber, but finished with the thing that had brought him here, the thing that had been building in him since the day he read the article in the magazine and felt the old machinery start to turn the gears that had been still for decades beginning to move again. The shooter waking up inside the old man, and the shooter had done what the shooter came to do, and now the shooter could go back to sleep and the old man could go back to watering the garden. The highway unrolled in front of him, flat and straight and dark, and the headlights made a tunnel of light through the Texas night and then the Oklahoma night, and then the particular darkness of the rural roads near Lawton, where the only lights are farmhouses, set far back from the road, and the only sounds are cattle in the fields, and wind in the trees, and the creak of old fences, and the distant lonesome whistle of a train that is going somewhere you will never go. He got home at 11. The house was dark, the way it was always dark when he came home because there was no one inside to turn on the lights. And the darkness of an empty house is different from the darkness of a house where someone is sleeping. It is flatter, more complete, more permanent. The darkness of a space that has forgotten what light looks like and has settled into the forgetting. He let himself in through the kitchen door. He put the thermos in the sink. He hung the keys on the hook by the refrigerator where Maggie had always told him to hang them and where he had always forgotten to hang them while she was alive, leaving them on the counter or in his pocket or on the table by the door, and she would find them and hang them on the hook and say nothing about it because Maggie understood that some battles were not worth fighting, and the key hook was one of them. And after she died, he never forgot again. He hung them on the hook every time without fail, because the hook was hers and the hanging was for her, and the habit was a way of keeping her instruction alive in the house where her voice no longer sounded. He walked through the dark house to the bedroom. He did not turn on the lights. He knew the house by feel, the way you know a body you have lived in for decades, every doorway and every threshold, and every piece of furniture in its place unmoved, unchanged, the geography of a life that had found its final form and would not be rearranged. He set the photograph back in its place on the nightstand next to the reading lamp Maggie used to leave on for him when he came home late from the hardware store on inventory nights, and the glass of water she used to set out for him because she said a man should have water by his bed in case he got thirsty in the night. And he now set out for himself a glass of water on the nightstand, filled every evening, emptied, or not by morning. The ritual more important than the water, because the ritual was hers and the doing of it was a conversation with a woman who could not answer, but whose presence in the house was as real and as permanent as the furniture. He sat on the edge of the bed and unlaced his boots and set them by the door side by side. The way he set them every night aligned, neat, the laces tucked, because a man's boots should be ready in the morning, and ready means organized, and organized means respectful of the day that is coming, even if the day that is coming is the same as the day that just ended. Even if every day is the same day, repeated the garden and the diner and the truck and the house and the silence and the photograph and the water glass and the boots by the door. He lay back against the pillows and looked at the ceiling and listened to the house settle around him, the way old houses do, the small sounds of wood and foundation and time, the creaking of joists and the ticking of pipes, and the particular intimate language of a structure that has been standing for 60 years and will stand for 60 more, and does not need anyone inside it to keep standing, but is better for the company. And whether he slept well that night or lay awake thinking about a valley and a boy and a shot that had echoed for 57 years and a handshake on a firing line and a name spoken aloud by a man who had learned it from a grandmother who had learned it from a grief that never healed, there is no one to say, because Earl Maddox lived alone, and the things that happen in the dark of a quiet house at the end of a long road are the private property of the man who lives there. And privacy is the last luxury of a man who has given everything else away. What is known as this? The Expo kept the plate. They took it down from its chain and mounted it on a wooden base and fixed a small brass tag to the place where the bullet had struck a dent in the steel that was slightly off-center and slightly below the midline, the mark of a round that had been sent through 800 yards of moving air to meet a moving target and had arrived exactly where it was supposed to arrive, exactly the moment it was supposed to arrive, and the tag was engraved in simple letters that read, May 2026, one shot, open sights, 800 yards, Earl Maddox. They mounted the plate on a wall in the main building. And every year on the third afternoon of the expo, somebody points to that plate and tells the new shooters about the day a 79-year-old man walked up to the firing line with a borrowed rifle and read the grass for 30 seconds and humbled every shooter on the line. And the story grows in the telling, the way stories do, the details sharpening, and the emotions deepening, and the meaning expanding until the story is larger than the event it describes, until it has become something that is not about marksmanship at all, but about something else, something harder to name and more important to understand. And the ones who really listen, the ones who do not interrupt and do not pull out their phones and do not immediately start talking about their own best shots and their own best rifles and their own best days on the range, learn the actual lesson, which was never about the shot at all. It was about who you stop and ask before you decide you know them. It was about who you laugh at and what that laughter costs when the truth comes out. It was about how little you can ever know about the silent man at the back of the crowd just by looking at his hat, in his truck, in his shaking hands. It was about the fact that the people who carry the heaviest things are almost always the ones least likely to set them down where you can see, because the weight is not a burden they are trying to share. It is a promise they are trying to keep. A promise to a boy who called the wind and did the math and grinned in photographs and did not come home. A promise that his sacrifice would not be forgotten, even if the remembering was done in silence, even if the carrying was done alone, even if the only evidence of it was a faint tremor in an old man's hands and a photograph on a nightstand in a garden that was watered on Tuesdays and Fridays for no reason the world could see. Earl Maddox did not ring that plate to prove anything to Tanner Briggs or to anyone else on that firing line. He had stopped needing to prove things to anyone in a valley overseas 57 years before most of them were born. The proving had been done. The proving had cost a 19-year-old his life. The proving was not something Earl wanted to do again, not ever. And the fact that the world kept asking men to prove themselves, kept setting up plates and challenges and competitions in measuring men by their ability to hit things, was a fact that Earl accepted without bitterness, because bitterness requires energy. And Earl had spent all his energy on carrying and watering and keeping promises that nobody knew he had made. He did it for Jimmy. He did it for a 19-year-old who never got old. A boy who called the wind for him on the worst day of his life. A boy who loved numbers and hated early mornings and ate crushed cookies from his sister, and who would have absolutely loved watching a room full of $30,000 rifles get shown up by a borrowed M1A and an old set of irons, and a man who still knew how to read the grass. He did it because Jimmy would have wanted to see it, because Jimmy would have done the math, because Jimmy would have called the wind, because Jimmy would have lain beside him in the grass and said the numbers in a voice that was cayman and steady and absolutely certain, the way he always said them, the way he said them on the last day, the last number he ever gave, the number that was perfect, the number that saved a company, the number that cost him everything. That is the story they tell at the expo now. The plate hangs on the wall with its brass tag, and the tag catches the light sometimes in the late afternoon when the sun comes through the west-facing windows, and the light finds the dent in the steel and the engraved letters and makes them glow for a moment. And the men who know the story see it, and they are quiet, and the men who do not know it see the quiet, and they ask the way men ask when they sense that a silence has a story inside it. And someone tells them, and someone always will.